Black Lotus is legal in this format? Entering Vintage can be a scary prospect, but it doesn't have to be. I'm going to take you through the entire Vintage metagame to get you ready for your first Vintage tournament. Let's begin. Welcome, possible Vintage gamers. Today, a metagame update. I'm going to go through all the decks in the format, show you what they're doing, how they're performing, and give you a basic overview of all the archetypes you're likely to see in a Vintage tournament. What you're looking at in front of you is the Vintage metagame dashboard, a public data set compiled by the community through Magic Online challenges and other premier events. Of all the matches being played basically at high levels on Magic Online. What you're currently looking at is 26,000 matches of Vintage starting from 11/18/22. The reason we're going to look at that date and onwards is because that is the introduction of Initiative on Magic Online. And I think the biggest meta shift since Magic put out Modern Horizons 2 and introduced Urza's Saga back in 2021. So we're going to look directly at the last 8 months or so of Vintage data on Magic Online, and I'm going to show you what is being played so that you have an idea going into your Vintage tournament. So the way we typically look at archetype levels in Vintage is decks featuring Mishra's Workshop, decks featuring Bazaar of Baghdad, decks that are more on the control spectrum, more on the combo spectrum, decks that are a green-based Deathrite Shaman, decks that are just an aggro deck, not fitting into these other categories. We have a little separate area for Oath of Druids combo, but Oath of Druids can also be played as control. And then we have a final section for Tinker. Tinker can sometimes be more combo, more control. It can even be a variety of, somewhat of an aggro hybrid. So we typically group some amount of Tinker decks down here in their own area. That's not to say all the decks that play Tinker are in here, but it's mostly decks that are focused on Tinker as a primary game plan. So let's start with Mishra's Workshop. Mishra's Workshop decks make up around 15% of the metagame and are currently dominated by a combo variant of Workshops. So you're seeing a deck called Jewel, or Workshop PO, something along those natures. If you were to search inside of Goldfish, you would find it under Paradoxical Outcome. This is a turn 1.5 combo deck using Mishra's Workshop to power out extremely powerful cards like Coveted Jewel. Now, you might not have heard of Coveted Jewel, commander card, but draw 3, can make 3 mana. There's some downside if your opponent attacks you and is unblocked, but for the most part, you're going to try to win the same turn you cast your Coveted Jewel. These decks are also playing the One Ring, and like I said, it is a Mishra's Workshop deck powering out broken artifacts. It does have enough blue cards and blue count to theoretically play Force of Will. It also, of course, uses PO as another powerful payoff spell, and this deck is going off, on turn 1 or turn 2 most of the time. However, it has a very nice backup plan in Urza's Saga, making construct tokens. This will give you some redundancy. If your opponent counters all of your payoffs, you can still win the game using your land. This deck is susceptible to counter magic, very susceptible to things like Null Rod, Hold Breacher, Collector Roof, Lavinia. These kind of cards are quite good against this deck. This deck is a bit of a glass cannon, though it does have the nice Saga backup plan, like we mentioned. It's not so far into the combo range that it's Belcher equivalent, but it is definitely pushing the barrier of what is the fastest and most powerful deck in the format. And this deck is doing quite well since the Initiative introduction on Magic Online. This is one of the highest performing decks in the format, if not the highest. Yeah, you would consider this deck to be maybe the second best performing deck in this data set. Now, combo shops, many combo shops or jewel shops or jewel PO, this deck is not what people would normally consider a Mishra's Workshop deck. Historically, Mishra's Workshop decks have been aggro and prison variants, and we do have some of those popping up in the metagame for a combined, 7% or so. And these decks are typically going to leverage things like Lodestone Golem and Sphere Resistance and Wasteland to kind of pressure your opponent on mana and make it so that it's hard for them to cast spells while you get to extract lots of value out of your Ancient Tombs and Mishra's Workshops, playing things ahead of curve, like Golos is a big one, searching for sagas and strip mines and that kind of thing. But also one of the stronger cards in recent introduction to this deck is Nettlecyst, just 3 mana, extremely large germ token wielding a ball, or I don't know exactly know what a Nettlecyst is. Let's be real here. So historically, aggro and prison shops truly represented sometimes as high as 20% of the vintage metagame. Now, very low percentage, only 7% combined. So. One of the other interesting things you'll note is we here have Bazaar of Baghdad. Bazaar of Baghdad is a historical vintage staple, but right now is representing 15% of the metagame, just like shops. And it's not all in Dredge. Historically, Dredge is the deck that most vintage players will recognize as the Bazaar of Baghdad deck. You mulligan until you find your Bazaar of Baghdad, utilizing Serum Powder, and then you're going to activate and dredge through your whole library, bringing back Narcomoebas and Icarids and that kind of thing, to play a very kind of all-in combo-centric graveyard deck. And this deck, historically was pretty weak to things like Leyline of the Void and Graveyard Hate. It had to play lands to play like Nature's Claim to remove them. This is no longer the case with the introduction of Force of Vigor. Force of Vigor being a free pitch spell to kill Leyline of the Void and other Graveyard Hate makes this deck extremely powerful. And Hollow One is also another card that allows you to skirt by graveyard removal and play this kind of tempo-y beatdown plan. Dredge is a deck that does fairly well on Magic Online and represents 5% of the metagame, but it is not the sole Bazaar deck anymore, and it's not even the most played Bazaar deck anymore. There are 2 different Vengevine Bazaar decks that are seeing play in Vintage, and they both actually are quite different. So sometimes it'll be labeled Hogak Vine, sometimes it will or will not have Hogaks. The term that I tend to use now is called Aggro Vine. Aggro Vine is a Bazaar of Baghdad deck that actually plays mana. So it plays Gaia's Cradles and Yavamayas and Besejus. And the main goal of this deck is to be very viable with 1 Bazaar activation and not need to utilize the graveyard. So what you're going to do is leverage the power of Collector Roof in this format to play, Collector Roof on turn 2 off of the Gaia's Cradle or a Yavamaya. You're playing free 8 Root Wallas to bring back your Vengevine. Hollow One also helps in that regard. Your main form of interaction is just going to be Force of Vigor. And then you're going to be able to really dodge Graveyard Hate. The only card that's going in your graveyard really is, and coming out of your graveyard is Vengevine. Sometimes it has Bloodghast and Hogaks, but like one of the main selling points of this Bazaar deck is it doesn't actually fold the Graveyard Hate. It mostly folds to opposing combo players. Now, there's a different Vine deck that is also very, very prevalent, the most prevalent Bazaar deck in the metagame, and that is Squee Hollow Vine. It will be referred to in this data set as Counter Vine. Now, this is something of a control/tempo deck. It's been kind of described as like Legacy Delver. And what you're doing is you are mulliganing to Bazaar of Baghdad using your Serum Powders, and you're going to try to offset the card disadvantage of Bazaar by playing 8 Squee effects. So you have Squee, Goblin of Bob, and Master of Death, cards that you can pitch and that will come back to your hand in the next upkeep. And then you're going to play a variety of interaction for negation, for vigor, for force of will, sometimes for Mindbreak Trap, for Noxious Revival, all free interactive spells to protect your tempo game plan of Hollow One, Vengevine, and 8 Root Wallas. This deck is extremely, extremely good against combo, but struggles pretty hard against decks running Wasteland. So it's actually really cool right now that Bazaar of Baghdad has 3 different builds. All of these builds are viable. Don't be put off by the less than 50% win rate here for Countervine. Countervine is a deck that's doing very well in like the very recent metagame. And you'll just find that these decks are actually good against different parts of the metagame, which means as a Bazaar player, you have options in how you want to play and build your deck. Control is a deck is an archetype that historically did very well in Vintage. Things like Gush, and you'll hear the term Xerox decks. those decks have fallen off quite heavily for a variety of reasons, but one of the big ones is there's a lot of Bazaar, and then there's also a lot of Urza Saga. Both of those cards present pretty big problems to a blue-based control deck. And what the blue-based control decks did is they introduced Wasteland into their mana base. And the one basically remaining blue kind of tempo-y / control deck is going to be Jeskai. It's actually going to be somewhat of a tap out tempo-y Wasteland version here. So you can see it's a Lurrus deck, and it's going to play Ragavan, Dreadhorde Arcanist, and Lavinia as its main creature threats, and then a variety of cantrips, swords, blue restricted cards, and a pile of forces. To combo with it combines these Wastelands here as a way of keeping the Bazaar and sagas in check. This deck is extremely hard to get working, and it doesn't see as much success as you would think, given that it is a 50% win rate deck with 7% of the metagame. But it is definitely a viable deck, and a deck that players who want to play that blue style of non-combo blue deck, it's definitely a choice that they can make. Definitely a deck that is going to be interested in playing against combo. You're going to have a lot of different pieces of counter magic to help you there. And a deck that is obviously still, even though you have Wasteland, it's still going to struggle versus some of the aforementioned Bazaar decks and that kind of thing. Combo is going to be, you can actually see most of these overarching archetypes are all around 15% right now, which is actually really, really, really good, because sometimes these things go as high as 20, 25. But right now, they're all around 16%. Combo decks, with the main proponent being Doomsday. You'll hear me say that I think Doomsday is the most powerful deck in the format, and that is definitely the best performing deck in this data set. Doomsday is a well-oiled machine. It has the most cantrips, the most counters, and one of the most compact pieces of combo of any deck in the format. So you are basically casting Dark Ritual to play Doomsday, cantripping into an Ancestral Recall or a Gush, drawing into a Black Lotus, and casting a Thassa's Oracle. This deck can win on turn 1, but I would say it's more of a turn 2 combo deck. And it is very, very good against decks that don't have the requisite number of counterspells, especially Flusterstorms. There was a point in the metagame where everyone had tons and tons of Flusterstorms, and Doomsday was a little suppressed. But right now, it's very hard to play Flusterstorm due to some of the other decks in the metagame not being blue-based combo. So you're in an interesting spot where this deck is probably good against combo decks because it has so much counter magic and so much redundant draw engines, and has a very compact combo. But it can suffer if it doesn't line up right against what the other players are doing. That being said, Doomsday very rarely suffers right now, as it is, like I said, the highest performing deck. Another combo deck in the format that sees a pretty reasonable amount of play, but has actually fallen off as of recently, is Underworld Breach. Underworld Breach is a combo deck that can be built in a variety of ways, which is why it's in the combo section and not the Tinker section, though Tinker is probably one of the most likely ways you'll see it built. Here you can see an example of an Grixis Underworld Breach deck that is using Lurrus and is playing kind of more of the blue controlling deck with like Wastelands and stuff, and that's definitely one way you can build Breach. A more common way to build Breach is with Tinker. Sometimes they get buried inside of this Tinker section on Goldfish, but if you go here, you find someone like the Deck 84, notorious Breach player. You can see here, this is a Tinker version of Breach, where your main plan is to do Underworld Breach combo, which is Underworld Breach, Black Lotus, and Brain Freeze to mill over your deck and then mill over your opponent's deck. But you also have access to, Tinker, Bolas' Citadel, which is one of the strongest plays you can make in Vintage, as well as having Urza Saga into Time Vault Key, taking infinite turns. So this is a deck that actually was the best deck in the format for a long time last year, and the year before that, but has recently fallen off, and the reason why are kind of up for debate. Some people say maybe mono white initiative is the reason why this deck has fallen off. It's hard to exactly pinpoint why. but it's still a deck people play, 3-4% of the metagame. There is another combo deck that was being played a lot, is pretty died off recently. Oops All Spells. That's a true actual Goblin Charbelcher turn 1 combo deck, all in. You just try to find your fast mana, and you play your Balustrade Spy, flip over your whole deck, and Dread Return Thassa's Oracle. You also have access to just Goblin Charbelcher with no lands in your deck, because all of your mana is artifact mana or flip lands, Seagate Restoration, and Awakening. And you can see you're doing this for Pact of Negation, a true turn 1 all-in combo deck. This deck had a kind of a renaissance a couple months, maybe not a couple months ago at this point, but maybe even a year ago at this point. But it has since kind of died down, and you don't see it as much. But it's something that can happen when you see a Chrome Mox across the table. It's either going to be Initiative or it's going to be Oops All Spells. A historical vintage deck that has really fallen off is Bug, Sultai, Deathrite Shaman. There's a lot of different ways you can build Deathrite Shaman decks, and you'll see that reflected here with a variety of different categories. But the two main ways you build Deathrite Shaman are with and without red mana. So you can see here's some examples of a Bug deck. Something that's going to use Deathrite Shaman and Collector Roof as your main hate bear, followed up by a bunch of blue restricted cards, Forces of Will, Negation, and Vigor. And then Oko is a very good catch-all controlling answer. These decks are pretty heavily hinged on how good is Collector Roof in the metagame, and currently Collector Roof is quite good in the metagame. So you're actually seeing a slight resurgence in Bug as of recently. This is a second place finish in a challenge by Duke 12. But even a couple of years ago, there was the Black Lotus turned into an elk, Bug winning the Vintage Eternal weekend. And since then, Bug has really struggled. I think it's pretty well agreed upon that the reason Bug is struggling is the introduction of Mono White Initiative to the format. And until Bug can find a way to reliably battle with Mono White Initiative while keeping its edge against artifact combo, I don't think we'll see a super huge Bug resurgence. There are people who play Bug with Red Splash. Big proponent of this deck is Yuta Takahashi, world champion, and you can see here you can splash red for Ragavan, Renin 6, Dax Maiden, Boo, Expressive Iteration. This is very much a Banded Legacy pile of fair non-white cards, and it is a deck that has some draws and power that can win, but it overall you can end up with a very clunky deck that doesn't even feel like you're playing the right format. I don't want to undersell it too much, but not a deck that I prefer to play, and not a deck that has performed super well. But it's a deck that you will see from time to time and can win tournaments. Both of these two decks are only representing 2% each of the metagame, which is quite substantial considering that Bug used to be one of the most played decks in the format. So quite wild in that regard. Next, we're gonna just keep going. We're gonna keep zooming through here. Mono White Initiative is the single most played deck in Vintage. It is a 15% metagame deck. It has by far the most plays in the last 8 months or so, and it is a good deck. It's a 51% win rate deck. So even though it is being played the most, it is still performing above 50% win rate. And it's a deck that you got to be aware of and be ready for when you're going to play a tournament, because people are going to play it. This is a very interesting, I guess you would say, kind of like a hate bears strategy. It hinges on playing tons of fast mana. So you have Chrome Moxes and Moxen and Ancient Tomb, and then we get to utilize Cavern of Souls to play a turn 1 hate piece. The two best hate pieces in Vintage are Thalia and Archon of Emeria. Archon of Emeria being the single best restrictive creature in the format. And so the main plan here is to use, even using Chancellor to power out a turn 1 Thalia, or preferably Archon, uncounterably if possible. And then while your opponent has a hard time, playing lands and casting spells, you follow up those hate pieces with the initiative creatures, Seasoned Dungeoneer, and White Plume Adventurer, which will give you a substantial clock by going down the Forge trap path of put 2 counters on it, deal 5 to your opponent. That can clock your opponent faster than they can get out from underneath the power of Archon of Emeria. Notably, one of the play patterns that people have discovered against this deck is because they are a Cavern of Souls deck, it's sometimes correct to, or even most of the time correct to force their fast mana. This will slow them down a turn and allow you to deploy your counter, your powerful combo and blue cards. I think this deck came out guns blazing back in September of 2022, and it had a pretty strong and convincing win rate then, but people have really adapted and changed their heuristics and play patterns, and I think we've settled into a point where that mono white is the most played deck and a very powerful deck and a very reasonable deck to choose in for a tournament, but not even close to a deck that is too good or anything for the format. So I typically argue that it's very good for the format because it keeps blue decks honest. You have to play removal typically to beat initiative. You can't rely solely on counter spells, which is something that blue decks have done in the past. So it's like actually moving the format into a more, sometimes into a more interactive and more removal based area. So big metagame player, mono white initiative. And mono white initiative is one of the big reasons that I'm actually remaking this video right now, a year later from my last introduction to vintage. And it's because I truly think that initiative has really changed the way vintage is played, and really makes for a different format than from before 11.22. So Oath is on a bit of a renaissance here as well. Oath is a deck that can be played in many different ways. Oath of Druids is a vintage-only combo-ish card, where it's a 1 and a green, and your opponent, if your opponent has more creatures than you, you flip over cards until you put a creature into play. The big resurgence for Oath is due to the printing of Atraxa Grand Unifier, basically one of the greatest creatures ever printed in Magic. This is a stabilizer in the fact that it's flying, vigilance, lifelinking 7/7, but it also is going to put cards like Force of Will into your hand. It's going to find 5-6 card types sometimes on its ETB. And you can build this deck in many different ways. Here you're looking at kind of a controlling deck. This deck has got a bunch of forces and planeswalkers and oathing into 2 Atraxa. That is one way you can build the deck, but you can also build the deck in a more combo-oriented fashion. Here's the deck playing 4 Atraxas and 4 Show and Tells. Notably, Atraxa is a card that's really good with restricted card Flash. It's been a while since we've seen Flash as a major metagame player in vintage, but it's quite good to pay 1 in a blue and get the Atraxa trigger. You can see this deck is also going to be running a bunch of fast mana and Tinker, so you can actually play Bolus's Citadel, which you can show and tell into play as well. This is a really cool combo variant of Oath of Druids. And I would say this is the main version of Oath of Druids that you're likely to see currently online, though in paper, maybe that's not the case. I do know that a lot of Oath players like to be either on one or two ends of the spectrum, where they're either a very controlling Oath deck or a very combo-oriented Oath deck. And you're going to see Oath is at like 5% mana share right now, which is quite high compared to its past numbers. So, and then we go into the Tinker decks. These used to be the best decks in the format, the highest performing decks, the highest meta share decks. They have immensely struggled in the post-initiative metagame. I shouldn't say initiative metagame because I don't think all of these decks are technically bad against initiative, but the post-initiative metagame of initiative, Jewel, Doomsday, Countervine as the main metagame forces, it seems like these saga-based Tinker decks have really, really struggled. The first one you'll see is Paradoxical Outcome, and this is something like I would refer to as a typical or traditional Paradoxical Outcome deck, usually Esper. It's hard to find them nowadays. Let's see if we can even find a single copy. This is just how far PO has fallen recently, is that you can't even find a list. Here is an Esper PO list from the land run. Let's see. Yeah, so this is like a very traditional Esper PO list. This is actually the kind of deck that I became known to play and known for playing. And it makes me very sad that this deck isn't seeing as much play. But this is a deck where you are going to, your main game plan is to use your tutor package, Mystical, Vampiric, and Demonic, to find Tinker, and Tinker for a Bolus's Citadel, which will likely win you the game in combination with things like Sensei's Divining Top to draw a card for 1 life. This deck has the secondary game plan of 4 Paradoxical Outcomes with all of your Moxen plus Mox Opal. Play a bunch of Moxen, pick them all back up with Paradoxical Outcome, draw a bunch of cards. It didn't cost you any mana because your Moxen remake mana when they come back down. that kind of thing. This deck typically played somewhere between a combo and combo control deck, where you actually had lots of ways to interact with your opponent through Lavinias and Narsets and Flusterstorms and that kind of thing. This deck did and does and sometimes doesn't play Urza Saga. I would say most lists play Urza Saga at this point. But yeah, this is a kind of deck that's kind of been maybe power crept or pushed out of the format a little, I would say. A historically extremely strong deck. At one point, people were calling for the restriction of Paradoxical Outcome itself. But right now, only a 4% meta share and declining. It's definitely still declining. Even more popular in recent memory are the Grixis and Esper Saga lists. These decks were using Urza Saga as a primary / secondary win condition in kind of the same way that PO was using Tinker. If I find... Gosh, I'm not sure. So this is not exactly... Might be hard to find a traditional one. What if I would go to Renee? Here, Renee has not an Esper list, but a Grixis list. Here's Renee's most recent Tinker Grixis list. So you see there's Urza Saga here. This list is actually pushing towards wheels. So it's playing Bowmaster, Hull Breacher, Time Twister, and Wheel of Fortune. But you don't have to do that. You have a lot of flexibility in how you want to build your decks that are based around Tinker and Urza Saga. So this one, obviously, you're playing Tinker Citadel and Urza Saga Time Vault Key. But you're also, this one's going to play some wheels and that kind of thing. But there's lots and lots of different ways you can actually put this deck together. If you want to play white, you can play white, in which case you'll play things like Lavinia and Teferi and Swords to Plowshares. And so it's kind of a metagame call when it makes sense to play white or when it makes sense to play red. Or if you want, you can play your Esper Saga Shell with initiative creatures in it. This has actually been a pretty high meta share as of recently. It's already climbing up almost over some of these other options. It is a deck that does look like it's performing very well, and it is performing all right now. But what the main thing that Initiative Tinker did is it had a very strong opening salvo. It had like the first month, it had like an extremely high win rate because it was a brand new archetype and people were getting some lots of free wins using it. Since then it has actually come down quite substantially, and now I think it's actually plateauing to a point where I think we're getting close to a viable Esper Tinker initiative hybrid deck. So here you can see an example. Recent lists are the first lists of this archetype played all 8 initiative creatures. More recent lists are playing only 4. So basically you're an Esper Saga deck almost exactly like a traditional Esper Saga deck, except you're using your flex slots to play just some White Plume Adventures, which is a powerful mechanic initiative. It's going to complement your construct clock, and you're basically just a Esper controlling Saga deck. You're basically this archetype here, and it's actually merging closer and closer to that archetype as the number of initiative creatures drop. Though I don't foresee them dropping below 4 initiative creatures, but this does definitely make sense to have the lower costing one as the one they're choosing to use. So definitely a deck you need to be aware of because it actually is representing almost the highest, it's getting close to the same meta share as traditional Esper Saga or PO. And I think it'll keep going up and stick around maybe 4% of the metagame. It has some good weekends, some not so good weekends. If you look in the last 45 days, you actually see it's had some pretty strong weekends recently. But if you had looked maybe 90 days, let's see what about 90 days? 90 days is a little bit less, right? So it's kind of gone, started very high, went very low, and now it's coming back up, and it's going to plateau and be, I think it makes sense to me that this deck is the way people want to play fair, quote unquote fair. I mean, it's still a combo deck playing Citadel and Vault Key, but not an all-in combo-oriented Saga deck. There are tons of other ways you can play Vintage and tons of other decks in the format. People brewing with the One Ring, people brewing with Hermit Druid, basically anything you can ever think of. But what I've gone and talked to you about today are the main Vintage players. This data sheet is a public data sheet, and the link will be in the description of the video. You can buy at any time, take a look at this data sheet. You can make your own copy and play around in it. I have no problem with anyone doing that. There's lots of different things you can look at. You can use the search to find, specific instances of who's playing what and how they did. There's always a nice little leaderboard function where you can see who the best players are on the platform. This is a really good example of a way to use the leaderboard function. Hey, Discover in here, this might be one of the strongest players on the platform. Well, let's go check out what kind of decks Discover plays. And you go to MTG Goldfish and search for Discover and oh, it's a Doomsday expert. So maybe this is a good starting point to find a working Doomsday list. Some things like that. There is a matchup table and graph function here. I would caution people that the data set inside of the graphs is a lot smaller than the data set inside of the overall dashboard. And the reason for that is it's much harder for us to get the actual match-to-match matchups. We have done some work in making that more automatic, and so we have some pretty good data. But here you can say, hey, I see that the most played deck in the format is actually going to be Initiative, right? So I can go to Aggro, I can go to Initiative if I know how to spell it, and then you can see, well, what does Initiative do well against? What does Initiative struggle against? Oh, I can see here that Initiative has a very, very bad matchup against combo shops, so Jewel. You can actually see, that there's 288 matches in this data set, which puts the confidence interval, 5%, 6%. So even if, right now it says it's 40% win rate is the matchup, but it could be anywhere statistically between 46 and 35, but for certain that this is actually an unfavorable matchup, which is really, really nice to know. So you can use this as a tool to see how decks are faring against each other. And I also highly recommend using the Goldfish's search feature. This is a really, really strong one in terms of figuring out if people are doing, how people are building decks. If you came to me and you said, Justin, how do I build Hermit Druid? Well, I would take, I would look for Hermit Druid vintage decks that were from a tournament, and I would search. And then here I have a list of all of the Hermit Druid decks that have placed inside of a tournament, or at least have been published inside of a tournament or a league in that date range. And you can do things like, hey, Justin, I want to see how many decks in the past year, how many paradoxical outcome decks are there that played Urza Saga. So first we would go, look for how many decks played paradoxical outcome. There's 664 in this, and then of that, how many played Urza Saga? It'll be very high because of the decks that are both that are the coveted Jewel deck. But let's just see. That'll show us how many non-Jewel, non-Saga PO decks there are. 5, 6. So there's only about 100 PO decks that didn't play Saga in any capacity, right? So you can do a lot of cool things like that to see what cards people are playing, what deck lists people are playing. Hey, can I find some example deck lists? These kind of resources are on the internet and public, and you can use them to your advantage. And so I highly recommend you do so. It's worth noting that these deck names are not exactly lined up with the categories on here anymore. They were at one point, and maybe in the future they will be. But you can still be able to piece together where different things are. There's also going to be a link in the bottom of this description to the Discord. The Discord is now named the Vintage MTGO Community. It is the #1 place on the internet and the largest place on the internet to talk about Vintage Magic the Gathering now. It is simply the place with the most active players who will help you. They will answer your questions. Sometimes they might be funny and trolly, but I promise if you go into the Discord and you're looking for help, and they will definitely help you. So Discord link is in the description as well. If you have never been to this channel before, my name is IMAxLevel1. I am a vintage streamer. I stream on Mondays at 8 p.m. Eastern, Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Eastern, and Saturdays at 1 p.m. Eastern for the Vintage Challenge on Saturday. And then all of my VODs go up on this YouTube channel as gameplay videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. You'll sometimes see me post other videos like this metagame video in between days. And so always be on the lookout for that. If you like this video and want to support the channel, best thing to do is to follow the Twitch channel and subscribe on YouTube. Both of those are free things you can do to help me